Hi everyone, this is Rosie, and today we are going to be sewing a quilted boxy bag finished with French seams in any size. So let's get started. Here's the bag that we will be making today in the video. I did use French seams to box in my corners, and the side seams are finished with binding. The French seams are my favorite way to finish those box corners instead of a binding, and just like the binding, it's very sturdy. I'm pounding on this bag and it is not collapsing. This bag measures 8 inches in length, 5 inches in width, and 4 inches in height. And I calculated my measurements using my downloadable worksheet, which I will link to in the description below the video. And one last thing that I want to say is that you do not have to be using quilted fabric to finish your boxed corners with French seams. Here is the worksheet showing all the calculations that I need to make the bag. I will not be going over how to use the worksheet in this tutorial, but I will put a download link in the description below the video to where you can get the worksheet and information on how you use it. In this tutorial, I want my bag to be 8 inches in length, 5 inches in width, and 4 inches in height. And our seam allowance is going to be 0.75 inches or 3/4 of an inch. Now normally I recommend a seam allowance of 1/2 inch, but because we are finishing this bag with French seams, I have upped my seam allowance to 3/4 of an inch to accommodate for those seams. Let's take a look at the materials that I will be using. I'm using 100% cotton quilting fabric for both my exterior and interior pieces. I have 2 strips of fabric right here that will be used for the accents on each side of the zipper. I started out with 2 pieces that are 2.5 inches wide. The length is equal to my vertical cut, and then I simply folded each piece in half and pressed them in place. These 2 pieces here will be used for binding my side seams, and they are 2 inches wide. And then I have 2 more pieces here that will be used for my zipper tabs. They are 4 inches high and 3 inches wide. I have the body of the bag quilted and cut to size, and I did use some Pellon 987F, which is a fusible fleece, to do my quilting. And then lastly, I have my zipper, which is a number 4.5 YKK zipper. For notions, you will need a pair of scissors, a rotary cutter along with a rotary cutting mat and ruler, a seam ripper, and a marking tool. Now, as always, I do like to use friction pens in my videos. I only use them for demonstration purposes because while the ink will disappear with heat, it can come back with cold, so always be careful where you use these pens. I will be using a point turner, wonder clips, and for my thread, I'm just using a general all-purpose sewing thread. This is a 50 weight, and it is from Aurifil. Now we can start constructing our bag. In this step, we will be installing the zipper. The first thing that I like to do is take my quilted panel, and I'm going to fold it in half. And this is my vertical cut right here. So I want to bring the 2 vertical sides together. And then I'm going to find the center of the panel and make a small clip. And then I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now I'm going to turn this over so that my lining side, this is the interior, facing up. Then I'm going to take my zipper, and I want to place the wrong side of the zipper against the lining. So this is the wrong side of my zipper right here. I'm going to place that on top of the lining, and I'm going to clip it all the way across. After I have it clipped into place, I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the zipper. I'm sewing on a Juki DX4000 QVP, which is also known as the Kokochi. I am using a stitch length of 3.0, and I'm stitching 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the zipper. And I will back stitch at the beginning and the end. Try and keep the edge of your zipper even with the edge of the fabric. Next, take one of your accent strips and you want to place the raw edge of that strip against the right side of the zipper, matching up all of your side edges here. And you're going to clip that in place. After clipping your strip into place, we will go back to the sewing machine and sew straight across with a 1/4 inch seam. Now you may be asking, can I clip everything together at the same time? And the answer is, of course, yes you can. This is just my personal preference. I do like to sew my zipper in first and then the accent strip in later. I'm sewing with a stitch length of 3.0 and my seam allowance is going to be 1/4 inch, and I will back stitch at both ends. Try and keep all of your edges even. Now that I have my strip sewn into place, I want to press that strip away from my zipper, just like this. And then I want to flip it so that I have the exterior side facing up. And I want to press this strip down towards the center of my quilted panel. And I'm going to hit it with a lot of steam because I like it to be nice and flat. Then I can turn it over and press it from this side. And you're going to see that this is going to leave you with a really nice finish on the inside of the bag. After everything is nicely pressed into place, we will top stitch 1/8 inch away from the edge of the fold of the accent strip. You can also top stitch 1/8 inch away from the edge of the zipper seam, but I prefer just a top stitch along the fold. I'm also going to place in just a few pins, which I did not include in the notion section, just to hold that strip in place for me. I'm top stitching about 1/8 inch away from the fold of the accent strip with a stitch length of 3.4, and I will back stitch at both ends. Now we're ready to sew the other side of the zipper to the opposite side of the quilted panel. Once again, we will be clipping the wrong side of the zipper to the lining. You want to make sure that all of your edges are even and just clip straight across. Then we will go ahead and sew this with a 1/8 inch seam. And after we finish sewing that seam, we could go ahead and add in our accent strip. And we'll do all of this together at the machine. I'm sewing 1/8 inch away from the edge of the zipper with a stitch length of 3.0. Do back stitch at each end and try and keep those edges even. I now have my accent strip clipped to the right side of the zipper, and we're going to sew straight across here with a 1/4 inch seam. Stitch length is still 3.0 and do back stitch. Just like before, we want to press that accent strip away from the zipper. Then I'm going to open my zipper all the way. And then I'm going to press that strip down towards the body of the bag. Then I'm going to place a few pins in just to hold everything in place for me so that we can do the top stitching along the folded edge. While we have our iron out, we can go ahead and prepare our zipper tabs. My 4-inch edge is running in this direction here. I'm going to fold the tab wrong sides together, bringing those 4-inch sides together, and press. Then I'm going to open it up, and I want to bring each one of these raw edges along the 4-inch side down to where that fold is that we just pressed into place. And then do the same exact thing on this side. You want them meeting there in the middle, and then press into place. Then you're going to fold this in half one more time, bringing those two folded edges together, just like this, and press. And at the sewing machine, you want to top stitch 1/8 of an inch away from each long edge, and we will do that together at the machine along with top stitching our accent strip in place. I'm top stitching 1/8 of an inch away from each long edge of the zipper tabs with a stitch length of 3.4, and I will back stitch at both ends. Then go ahead and prepare your second tab in exactly the same way. Now I'm top stitching approximately 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge of my accent strip with a stitch length of 3.4 and do back stitch. In this step, we're going to cut out our box corners and sew up our side seams. But before we do, I have a confession to make. In looking at my worksheet, I see that my vertical cut was supposed to be 13.5 inches, and what I realized is that I actually cut it 13.75 inches. So the old woodworking rule of measure twice, cut once is a good one for us to use. But I'm not going to worry about it because it's only 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to flip this over, and if you remember, we cut a little notch in the center of our panel. We want to take that notch and measure it up with the center of the zipper, just like this, and put a few clips in to hold it in place. And then I'll do the same thing to this side here. Find that center notch, match it up with the center of the zipper, and clip. Now I just want to smooth everything out, make sure everything's laying nice and flat, and I'll add in a couple more clips just to secure everything. I don't want anything moving around when I'm doing my marks. So I have enough clips here, and I'm going to look at my worksheet, and it says that I need to measure in 2 inches from the raw edge, so that would be here, and 1¼ inches up from the fold, so that would be here. So I'll take my ruler and place it so that I'm 2 inches in from the raw edge and 1¼ inches up from that fold. And then I'm just going to draw in my lines. I'll do this on each corner. And for this, you really do want to measure twice and cut once. So I'm going to go ahead and mark all of my corners. All of my corners are marked, and I did go ahead and double check them to make sure everything was correct. And now I'm just going to cut them out. I finished cutting out all 4 corners and I removed my clips. Now I just want to open my zipper all the way, and I want to flip this so that we have the exterior sides, right sides together. And I can go ahead and close up the zipper. Now, we're going to sew these side seams, but remember our seam allowance is 3/4 inch, so we do want to sew that 3/4 inch from the edge. And I am going to mark that 3/4 inch line. I marked my seam allowances, and now I want to clip my side seams together. So you want to make sure that all of your edges are even, and put a clip in place. That notch should still be lining up with the center of your zipper. Now, I'm also going to add in my zipper tabs here. I'll fold them in half, and you're going to place this on top of the right side of the zipper. But I want to place it about 3/8 inch down from this edge right here, from the outside edge of the bag. And the reason why is because this is a 3/4 inch seam, and we are going to be trimming it down later. So I will just put in a few more clips. And then on this side, you want to open up your zipper and unzip it towards the center of the bag. It doesn't have to go down too far. And clip your edges together. And then the same thing, you'll take your second tab, fold it in half, and place it on the right side of the zipper, about 3/8 inch in from the edge. If you want, you can hold it in place with a pin. It doesn't have to be exact. And then finish clipping. And now we're ready to go ahead and sew these side seams. My seam allowance is 3/4 inch, and my stitch length is 3.0, and I will back stitch at both ends. I'm approaching my zipper, and I am going to sew straight over it. You never ever want to sew over metal zipper teeth with your sewing machine. This is a nylon zipper, and I know that my machine can handle it, so I'm going to sew straight over it. And I'm also going to back stitch over that area because that's where my zipper pull is, and I want to make sure that it's nice and secure. Then you can flip over to the other side. You're going to sew everything exactly the same way. Make sure that your zipper tab is still in place there. And back stitch at both ends. When you're done sewing those side seams, you want to trim them down to 3/8 inch. Then take your 2-inch binding strip and clip it to the zipper side of your side seam. After it's clipped into place, we're going to sew it by following along our previous line of stitching. I'm sewing the binding in place with a stitch length of 3.0, and I'm just going to follow along that previous line of stitching. And I am going to backstitch. Try and keep all of those edges even. You may notice I have 2 lines of stitching here. The inner line is actually my quilting line. After that binding is sewn into place, press it away from the bag and flip it over. We're going to fold this long raw edge down towards the edge of our side seam, just like this. And then we're going to fold it over again so that it's folding over the seam and clip it in place. And you want this folded edge to be covering your line of stitching. Then at the machine, we're going to sew this down by stitching in the ditch. And the ditch is right here, right where that seam line is. And you'll stitch all the way across and back stitch at both ends. I'm going to stitch in the ditch with a stitch length of 3.0 and back stitch at both ends. And when you're done, just turn it over to make sure that you caught that fold in your line of stitching. Go ahead and trim off the ends of your binding. And then you'll finish your other side seam in exactly the same way. Now I'm going to open my zipper up all the way, and I want to turn this so that it's right side facing out, or the exterior side facing out. In this step, we will sew our boxed corners. So I'm going to take my piece, and I want to make sure that the edges of the box are even with each other on both sides. And once I'm sure that everything looks even, I want to cut a little clip right in the fold, right here. And I'll do that on all 4 corners. Just make sure those edges are all nicely lined up before you do any cutting. And that is going to be the center of the seam for the box. After you've cut out all the notches from your box corner, you want to take that box corner and spread it apart just like this. You want to match up this side seam right here with the notch. And that side seam needs to be pointing towards the bottom of the bag. So line everything up and put a few clips to hold everything in place. Now we want to sew this together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And you may be wondering why we're using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance when our calculation, or the seam allowance in our calculation, is 3/4 of an inch. For a French seam, we're actually sewing 2 seams. We're sewing a seam on the exterior side, and after we're done sewing all of our exterior seams, we're going to flip this so that the interior side is facing right side out. And then we will sew a second seam to form our French seam, and that seam will also be 3/8 of an inch. So we will effectively be sewing 2 seams in each corner, and they both need to add up to 3/4 of an inch. And that is why each seam allowance will be 3/8 of an inch, because that is half of 3/4 of an inch. I'm sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and my stitch length is 3.0. You do want to back stitch. Now go ahead and sew up the other 3 boxed corners in exactly the same way. I have finished sewing all of my boxed corners, and now I want to trim them down to approximately 1/8 of an inch. So you'll trim all 4 corners in exactly the same way. After you have them trimmed, go ahead and open up your bag. You want to turn it so that the lining side is facing out. Then I like to take my point turner and get into each one of those corners and push it out nicely. And then I will also take it over to the iron and give it a good amount of steam. And I'm going to go ahead and iron mine off camera. To finish the French seam, we want to sew our box corners one more time from the lining side. And you're going to sew 3/8 of an inch in from the edge. Make sure that your seams here are nice and flat. When we sew that 3/8 of an inch, it's going to catch the raw edge from the exterior side. And once again, we're sewing 3/8 inch seams because we're sewing 2 seams now, and they both need to add up to our 3/4 inch measurement for our seam allowance. So I'm going to lay this down, and I'm going to mark my seam allowance in 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, and I will use a chalk marker to do this so you can see the line. Now after you mark your line, you can go ahead and measure it. It should be 4 inches because our bag is supposed to be 4 inches high. So go ahead and take a look and see what the measurement is, and it's just about 4 inches, so we're good. We're going to put a few clips in here, and then we will sew that seam 3/8 of an inch in from the edge. I'm sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a stitch length of 3.0, and as always you want to back stitch at both ends. And then you can go ahead and sew the other 3 seams in exactly the same way. Here are my French seams all completed, and this is what it looks like on the side of the bag. The French seams really are my favorite way for finishing the inside seams of the boxy bags. And it will give good body to your bag, the same as the binding, but I think it's a much cleaner, nicer finish. And the French seams can also be done on non-quilted fabrics. So go ahead and give everything a nice pressing, and then you will be done. Here is our bag all completed. Now we set out to make a bag that was 8 inches in length, 5 inches in width, and 4 inches in height. So let's see how we did. I'll measure my length first. Now remember, I did make an error in my cutting, so I like to really stretch it out when I'm measuring, because the thickness of the fabrics and the interfacing that you use all take up space. So I am at about 8 1/8 inch. So that's good. Let's measure the side. The side is just at about 5 inches, and the height is right at 4 inches. So we were successful in our measurements. I do hope that this tutorial has been helpful to you and that you might have learned something new. I want to thank everyone who has supported me by liking my videos and subscribing to my channel. I would love to see you over at my Facebook group, which is Rosie and David Patterns, and I'd also love for you to visit my Etsy shop, which is Rosie and David US.